I try to daven, I try to pray, and I'm struggling. I'm at a loss. I'm at a loss. Young men, fathers, sons, husbands, killed. We hear about those who were killed. I'm now in Jerusalem, and we go visit wounded in the hospital, and it's unbelievable. Families are shattered forever, and I don't understand it, and I struggle with it. And that's all part of the Tisha B'Av experience, to try to grapple with what appears to be a distancing. But yet I believe in God. I believe that I'm only a puny human being. Why should I understand the way God runs the world? And I read the keynote that were written in the wake of the destruction of the temple, struggling to retain a connection to God. And I read them now and I find them meaningful.
In the Jewish calendar, we're now in the 3 weeks that precede the 9th of the Hebrew month of Av, Tisha B'Av, when we commemorate the destruction of the temples in Jerusalem and many other Jewish tragedies in history. To mark the first Tisha B'Av, following October 7th, I was joined by my teacher, the rabbi and professor Jacob J. Schacter, to discuss how we reckon with new Jewish tragedies. Welcome to the Tikvah podcast. I'm your host, Jonathan Silver. For many of us, the deaths, not only of October 7th, but now of the many soldiers who have subsequently fallen in the defense of Israel, have, over this period of time, kept the question in the forefront of our mind. So we're rebroadcasting that initial conversation with Rabbi Schacter to deepen your own reflections on memory and the miraculous nature of Jewish endurance. You can subscribe to the Tikvah podcast on Apple Podcasts, Google Play, and Spotify. I hope you'll leave us a 5-star review to help us grow this community of ideas. I welcome your feedback on this or any of our other podcast episodes at podcast@tikvah.org. And of course, if you want to learn more about our work at Tikvah, you can visit our website, tikvah.org, and follow us on Facebook and Twitter. Here now is my conversation with Rabbi J.J. Schacter. Rabbi Schacter, welcome back to the Tikvah podcast.
It's a great pleasure to be with you. I am a huge admirer of you and of the work that you do and the work that Tikvah does. My association with Tikvah has brought me and continues to bring me great meaning, and it's an honor and a privilege to be with you once again.
Rabbi Schacter, our subject today has to do with the fact that very soon the Jewish people will commemorate one of the annual days of fasting that helps us bring to the forefront of our mind Jewish tragedies from the past of our people. But this year, we are also remembering a real Jewish tragedy, a Jewish calamity, the martyrdom of over 1,000 Jews in the Gaza envelope in the communities of the Western Negev on October 7th. And the thing that I want to discuss is how our commemoration of those martyrs relates to the liturgical cycle of Jewish memory and other experiences of martyrdom that our people has suffered in the past.
I'd like to sharpen your question by noting that this Tisha B'Av, this coming fast day that annually commemorates primarily but not exclusively the memory of the destruction of both temples, we are not just remembering these martyrs, but we are actually living through the ongoing tragedy. It's not something that happened on October 7th and we have to figure out a way how to access it in a meaningful manner. But every day we're still deeply, deeply involved in and affected by what happened then and what continues to unfold. And so we're entering into this sad time of year. In Jewish tradition, there's something known as the 3 weeks that slowly builds up to the crescendo of the 9th of Av. We're now entering into it already deeply engaged in the sadness and the suffering. To sharpen the point, I would say the following. Rabbi Joseph B. Soloveitchik has a very thoughtful insight, differentiating between what we call immediate mourning and what we call historical mourning. In Hebrew, avelut chadasha, new mourning, and avelut yeshana, older mourning. Avelut chadasha, new mourning, is, God forbid, the mourning that is part of the human process. Someone loses a close relative. It's direct and it's new and it grabs us. Old mourning is mourning for an event, a historical event that happened a long time ago. In Jewish law, new mourning begins at the highest level of mourning. So we have the funeral, and then we have something called Shiva. We have 7 days a week of intense mourning, and then slowly it begins to dissipate. So there's the period known as Shloshim, 30 days. In the case of parents, it's an entire year. But as time goes on, it gets less and less and less and less. But it begins most intense. When it comes to the old mourning, it's the opposite. It starts slowly during the 3 weeks, no weddings, minimize a sense of joy. And then we come to the month of Av, what's called the 9 days, and then the week of Tisha B'Av, and then the evening of Tisha B'Av, then the day it builds up in intensity. And that makes sense because when, God forbid, someone is struck by an immediate tragedy, it's most intense. But then slowly, we need to figure out a way how to resume at least some semblance of normal life. So we slowly try to transition. In the case of an old tragedy, we have to build up. It's such a long time ago. We have to slowly get into it and think about it and ascend in the level of intensity of mourning. Every year, but not this year. This year, we have a running start. And it's not just because October 7th wasn't very long ago. It's because October 7th is still ongoing and still continuing. And the question, therefore, is, and your question, I think, is very germane and very thoughtful and appropriate, is Ma nishtana ha-tisha b'av hazeh mikol ha-tisha b'avs? How different is this Tisha B'Av going to be? Is this upcoming day of fasting and commemoration, how different this is going to be than those in the past? And I think it will be very difficult and very different. And I think the experience that we have gone through and are still going through is deeply going to color the observance of, the commemoration of, the engagement with this particular fast day and commemoration experience. I am aware of a number of elegies that have been written specifically for October 7th and its aftermath, which will be recited in many communities on this coming 9th of Av, Tisha B'Av. I am aware of a lot of effort that's being done to plumb the depths of already existing elegies that have been recited for centuries on the 9th of Av, and looking for nuances or phrases or images that particularly resonate in the post-October 7th reality. So I think the experience of the 9th of Av in the context of or under the influence of October 7th is going to take a few different forms. One is new liturgical creations specifically for that. And the other is, well, let's look at what we've already been saying, but through the light of, through the prism of, through the experience of what we have just gone through and continue to go through.
We're approaching this question just days away from our community's commemoration of the 9th of Av. And that means that we're thinking about commemorating this day, marking this day, and asking ourselves how the tragedy that is still very much around the people of Israel will be felt on that day. But that's not the same thing as asking how the Jewish community, as a community that is intergenerational, that will outlive all of the Jews who are alive on this earth today, will remember October 7th. And one option is to subsume the tragedy of that day in our tragedy day, in our 9th of Av fast, and to recitate elegies that call to mind our mourning. Another option is to say, well, actually, we can commemorate this day on the very day that it happened, because we know the day that it happened. And historically, in Jewish communal decision-making, that has been a process that's gone in different directions. I wonder if you can invite us into some historical examples of how that's worked in the past. What factors might contribute to a communal decision about October 7th and Tisha B'Av going forward?
As far as the question about how October 7th and its aftermath will be remembered for generations to come. I have no idea. It's very raw. We're living through it. For us, it is overwhelming and incredibly intense. I have no idea how this is going to be perceived of in 30, 40, 80, 100 years from now. The broader question, I think, is very, very important because one option is let's subsume it under the 9th of Av. Another option is let us observe it and remember it on the day that it happened. Well, that poses a particular complex problem in this case because it happened on a holiday, on Simchat Torah. The state of Israel has already determined a day set aside by national Israeli law to remember October 7th, which is fascinating to me. There's already been an effort in the Knesset to determine a day on which this event will be remembered for posterity. And they didn't choose October 7th. They did not choose Simchat Torah. They did not choose the day after Simchat Torah because that is a day that in the diaspora, Simchat Torah is celebrated. In Israel, the holidays are one day, but outside of Israel, they're 2 days. So it happened at the end of the Sukkot holiday on the last day of Sukkot here in Israel, but in America or elsewhere in the diaspora, there was still another day to go. So they decided it's going to be 2 days after Simchat Torah. That I don't remember the exact Hebrew date, but it's the Hebrew date 2 days after. What that day will look like, I don't know. It hasn't happened yet. And I'm actually very curious to see how that is going to unfold and what will be done on that day. But the question about the nature of the relationship to the 9th of Av, I think, is really important. Because as you point out, the 9th of Av has been perceived of as a catch-all date on which all Jewish tragedies should be commemorated, including the Holocaust. And on the other hand, history has shown that when deemed appropriate and when a tragedy was considered to be massive enough, a decision was made to create a separate day to remember that tragedy. And this is a long-standing debate throughout Jewish history. Should it be on Tisha B'Av? Everything is on Tisha B'Av, which essentially started in one of the elegies that is recited on Tisha B'Av for the Crusades, where the author says, well, why am I mentioning the Crusades today if just a page or two earlier, the author tells us exactly the dates when the communities in Speyer, Worms, and Mainz were attacked in 1096, and they were in the months of Iyar and Sivan, which is 2 or 3 months before the month of Av. And he says, well, the reason why we're doing it today, even though it didn't happen today, and I just told you it didn't happen today, is because we don't add days of mourning. Everything falls under today. And that text was brought up again by a number of religious decisors when it came to the Holocaust, that there should not be a separate commemoration for the Holocaust. There should not be a fast day for the Holocaust. There should not be a day set aside designated to commemorate the Holocaust, because after all, we have this precedent that everything is on the 9th of Av.
Rabbi Schacter, I want to come back to the Shoah in just a moment, but before that, as a general matter, what's wrong with proliferating fast days? Why should we guard against that?
There's a Talmudic passage that says that if we were to commemorate and remember, but not just remember, but remember intensely, even significant Jewish tragedies, then regretfully, on top of regretfully, we'd be remembering a lot of Jewish tragedies many days of the year. And I think that emotionally and psychologically, there's wisdom to try to minimize days of sadness and days of emotional depletion, and let's call it anxiety, let's call it feeling overwhelmed with being crushed by tragedy, in order to be able to go on with life. So that's the balance here. On the one hand, we need to remember, but our history is such that there's a lot of sadness to remember. There is a phrase that was coined by the late Sela Baron, a very famous, prominent Jewish historian who taught at Columbia University for many years. It's called the lachrymose conception of Jewish history, which means that The perception of Jewish history is sadness and suffering and pain, and he pushed up against that. And that's what we're struggling with. We don't want to internalize all of this sadness, because then we won't be able to continue to have positive, meaningful, joyful, happy, optimistic lives, which we need to have as human beings and as a nation and as a people. So that's the balance.
I want to just zoom out and underscore something very important that you just said, which is that when determining whether to have a fast day or when to have a fast day, history is a factor, but history is sometimes not the determining factor. The determining factor is what contributes to the overall strength of the nation. How do we internalize this as a people and bring it into our historical, religious, liturgical consciousness? It is not only a question of, did this happen on this day, therefore we'll mark it on that day. That's not the question that decides how to commemorate a moment of Jewish tragedy. The question that determines whether to commemorate a Jewish tragedy is the effect that it will have on us as a people. That's a deep insight.
And I appreciate that you draw attention to that. The critical issue that I think every generation has to face is, how can we perpetuate Jewish life and Jewish existence? My job, and I'm talking now as a father, is to ensure that my kids and my grandchildren have a fealty to the tradition in a way that will perpetuate its continuity for generations to come. It doesn't have to be exactly my fealty. It can't be. They're growing up in different worlds. But there's this core commonality of a commitment to a continuity that is non-negotiable. And so the question is, what do we need to do to ensure that? That's the point of departure. Now, I need to take into account that our people had a past. Without a past, you can't have a future. I mean, just think about every individual. I can't function as a human being in the present and think about a future without understanding where I'm coming from, who my parents were, what my childhood experiences were. Even if you don't go to therapy, and you should be going to therapy, but even if you don't go to therapy, that's obvious that it's important to understand and to appreciate the past in order to understand the present and the future. And that's true for a country, for a nation as well. And so therefore, part of what it means to perpetuate a tradition and an awareness of a continuity of a people is to understand its history. And then you ask yourself, well, how can I best understand that history and remember that history and act in a way that that history is important to me in the context of trying to pass on a value for the next generation? And I can't do that if I'm wallowing in sadness and in suffering all the time. I need, for the sake of continuity and for the sake of a future, to be happy, to be joyful, to present Judaism as something meaningful, to present Judaism as something that enhances my life, to present Judaism as something that brings me great, great meaning and significance and joy, without denying the serious issues of sadness. So you're 100% right, Joe. The point of departure is, what am I going to do to ensure that there's going to be a Judaism in 100 years from now? And part of that is figuring out a way not to deny my past, both the happy part and the sad part, but to figure out a way how to incorporate it into a mode of ongoing meaning for myself and for my people.
I just want to mark that I diverted you. You were going to lead us through the case study of the Shoah and how the Shoah was determined whether it should be commemorated on its own day or subsumed under the 9th of Av. And I want to stay in diversion land for another moment, because the effect of concentrating so many episodes of Jewish tragedy under the 9th of Av, I think, has a theological implication. The theological implication is that we tend to focus on the commonalities of all of those tragedies. If we were to commemorate the slaughter of this European community during the Crusades and that pogrom and the third Farhud, and we were going to look at all of the different moments of Jewish suffering, we would be emphasizing the particularities of each case. But one effect of bringing them together is that it helps us focus on the things that they share. And one of the overriding themes, one of the overriding anguished questions that the keynote, the elegies of Tisha B'Av raise for us is, where was God? Where was God at this moment in Jewish history, and where was God at that moment in Jewish history? And I can't help but think that one of the deep questions right now in our moment, because the perspective we have is still on, we're still processing the suffering of October 7th. We're asking all sorts of questions about where was the IDF and where was the government and all of that. And those are important. I don't want to minimize those. But I can't help but think that in time, as this tragedy gets incorporated into the liturgical consciousness of the Jews, we're going to be asking that theological question here too.
You raise a number of points that are all worthy and thought-provoking. Let me start with what I believe was the first point before you brought it home to October 7th. And that is, you make the correct point that by subsuming all Jewish tragedies under the 9th of Av, and let me point out that in the Ashkenazi keynote book, there are references to not only the destructions of the temples that took place on that day, there are references to the 10 martyrs in the 2nd century that took place over the course of 100 years, the destruction, the murder of the 10 martyrs, Asara Harugei Malchut. There is, as I mentioned, 3 or 4 elegies about the Crusades that happened in 1096. There is a mention of a burning of wagon loads full of Jewish manuscripts in Paris in 1242 in an elegy by Rabbi Meir of Rothenburg entitled Sha'ali Srufa Ba'esh, also very much central to the keynote book of the Ashkenazi community. In the Sephardi community, the keynote book includes references to the Spanish expulsion. So there's a lot that we mention that certainly in the case of the Ashkenazi keynote book, do not at all refer to events that happened on the 9th of Av. And so the argument was made based on the passage of the Crusade Kina, the Crusade elegy that I mentioned a moment ago. Well, the reason why we're mentioning it today, even though it didn't happen today, is because, well, that's what we do, because the 9th of Av is a day set aside to commemorate all Jewish tragedy. In a sense, the price we pay, and I'll explain in a moment why we're prepared to pay that price, is a flattening of the historicity of each of these events. What we lose is, well, I mean, what happened in the Crusades is a whole different story than what happened in 1242 in Paris, is a whole different story than what happened during the Hadrianic persecutions. The entire context, the world, the events, the context is radically different. And all of that gets effaced when we bunch them all together under this day. And that's exactly, I think, the point that we're trying to make. My lay teacher, Professor Yosef Chaim Yerushalmi, published a lot, but his probably most celebrated book is Zachor, subtitled Jewish History and Jewish Memory. And he points out that Jews are really not historians, but Jews had great memories. And this is a good example of that I'm not interested on the 9th of Av in the history, in the specificity of the story and the events of each one of these tragedies. I'm interested in one thing. I'm interested in my relationship to God. I'm interested in how can I frame my ongoing relationship to God when I am faced with what on the face of it seems to be God turning his face away from me, that God is rejecting me, that God is punishing me, that God is destroying me, that God destroyed his temple. The temple was the central focal point of my relationship to God, and God now turned away. Does that mean that God now has abandoned me? Does that mean that I abandoned God? What does that have to do with my relationship to God? How do I continue to maintain a faith in God? And that is the focal point in all of these tragedies. I'm not interested in what was the cause of the Khmelnytsky massacres in 1648, or why were Jews massacred in Blois in France in 1171. I'm interested in what does that have to do with me and God now? Or what does that have to do with God and me now? And I would invite your audience to consider that when one reads the Elegies, the keynote, one finds something what I think is really fascinating. And that is, there is not even a focus on the historical events surrounding the destruction of the temples. You would think that these are the two major events that happened on that day. The Mishnah tells us both temples were destroyed on that day. Tell me the story, tell me the background, tell me the Babylonians, tell me the Romans, zero. That even the story of the destruction of the temple is not told historically. The basic and fundamental theme of the keynote is, I am struggling to maintain, to retain, to strengthen my relationship to God in the face of what appears to be God's turning away from me. That's the core issue, even in the context of the destructions of both temples. And so that carries all the way across. That carries across all the centuries. That carries across right now. I am overwhelmed by this question right now. I try to daven, I try to pray, and I'm struggling. I'm at a loss. I'm at a loss. Young men, fathers, sons, husbands, killed. We hear about those who were killed. I'm now in Jerusalem, and we go visit wounded in the hospital, and it's unbelievable. Families are shattered forever, and I don't understand it, and I struggle with it. And that's all part of the Tisha B'Av experience, to try to grapple with what appears to be a distancing. But yet I believe in God. I believe that I'm only a puny human being. Why should I understand the way God runs the world? And I read the keynote that were written in the wake of the destruction of the temple, struggling to retain a connection to God. And I read them now and I find them meaningful. And that's the context in which I'm going to be reading the keynote this year, to try to wrest from them, W-R-E-S-T, a sense of connection. And I'm also going to be looking for hope. You know, it's so interesting that even on the 9th of Av, a day that's set aside to commemorate tragedy, Rabbi Soloveitchik pointed out often that it's also a day of nechama, it's a day of comfort. As the day goes on, things get easier. You know, the custom is you sit on the floor, you can't sit on a chair, you have to sit low like a mourner, you can't prepare any food for the evening. But as time goes on, after the midday, you get up, you can sit on a chair, you can prepare food. In the afternoon service, one can put on tefillin that one does not do in the morning. There's a prayer called Nachem, a paragraph that's inserted only one time the entire year, and that's at Mincha, the afternoon service on Tisha B'Av. And Nachem means nechama, means comfort. That with the tragedy, there's also a faith, there's also a future, there's also an optimism that the Jewish story will continue. So I guess to wind down with thoughts that your thoughtful question triggered in me, I think historically you're right. We pay a price, but it's a price that we're totally prepared to pay because it's not even a price, because history on Tisha B'Av is not of paramount importance to me. It's my relationship to God, and that's the case even in the context of those passages relating to the destruction of the temple. And the aftermath of October 7th, the ongoing aftermath and continued saga of October 7th continue to raise those questions.
After that, now I do want to go back to the historical analysis that you were offering, because there is a question that was felt by Jewish communities in the late 40s and early 50s of the last century. The Shoah is just too massive. It's not just a pogrom, but bigger. It's something else. And it's not like, when I say not just a pogrom, pogroms are not good, but this is not just not good, but worse. It's different. It's evil. It's something else. And for us to mark with the appropriate historical gravity and moral seriousness of that day, it can't simply be subsumed. Or maybe the opposite. It must be subsumed. And I want you to just bring us into that debate and help us understand how that decision was talked about.
In 1950, the speaker of the Israeli Knesset, Yosef Shprintzak, recognized that it would be important for the state of Israel to formally and nationally acknowledge and remember and commemorate the Holocaust. In 1948, when the state of Israel was founded, there were about 600,000 Jews who were living in the land of Israel, of whom about 150,000, roughly 25%, were Holocaust survivors. These Holocaust survivors commemorated the Holocaust, obviously, in their bodies and in their hearts every single day. But there were various annual remembrances that were commemorated in various different parts of the land of Israel. It wasn't yet the state of Israel. But Spritzak understood that this can't just go on a little bit here, a little bit there, in this kibbutz, in this town, in this Landsmannschaft, but there had to be something that the entire nation needed to recognize. And set aside a committee, and the committee met, and it was clear that a separate day had to be established. And it was not going to be on the 9th of Av. There were those who suggested maybe it should be on the 10th of Tevet, which was already a fast day that was observed by some. But the consensus was that there had to be a separate day to commemorate it. For a long time, it was associated with the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising because it was really important for those who were living in Israel at the time not to come fully to terms with the horror and what they called the passivity and the diaspora disaster. And they went to search for redemptive moments that they could point to as meaningful to them. And so the ghetto uprising was something that was very centrally important. But whatever the day was going to be, it would have to be a separate day. And they went back and they pointed out that there were already separate days that were set aside besides the 9th of Av. I mentioned before, Blois in 1171, the tradition was that the 20th of the month of Sivan, when that event happened, was set aside as a fast day. After the Khmelnytsky massacres in 1650, when there was a respite, there's no doubt that there was a fast day that was established. It happened to be on the same day, on the 20th of Sivan. And so in his speech in the Knesset, the chairman of the subcommittee says, well, if we set aside a separate day on the 20th of Sivan to commemorate Khmelnytsky, then, oh my God, the way you frame what the Holocaust was, it's not just Khmelnytsky plus, this is an entirely different universe. Then for sure we should have a separate day. It is unsubsumable. It bursts out of any constraints. You can't link it. Forget about subsuming it to anything. It is massive. It is huge. And so the argument is made that there should be a separate fast day. The Ashkenazi chief rabbi of Israel at the time, Rabbi Yitzchak Isaac Halevi Herzog, writes a responsum in January of 1945, when the war is still going on, and says, I think we should establish right now a separate fast day for eternity to commemorate the Holocaust. And one of his precedents is the fast of the 20th of Sivan. And so one side of this equation is we need something separate. It's actually offensive to think that this could be subsumed under anything else. It was mostly the Haredi community that took the opposite position and went back to that passage in the Crusade Kina about one does not add days of mourning, B'chi ein lahosif moed shever v'tav'era, lachen hayom livyati a'orara, that one does not add days of sadness and mourning and lamentation. And therefore today, i.e. on the 9th of Av, I'm going to arouse my sadness. And said, no, we must subsume. There's a continuum of Jewish tragedy. All Jewish tragedies, even the Holocaust, is a function of the fact that the temple was destroyed. So there's no question that the objective assessment of the Holocaust is not just Khmelnytsky plus or anything plus. The Haredi community was devastated by the Holocaust. But theologically, it has to be part of a continuum as a result of the lack of a temple and the imperfection of the world. And everything needs to be commemorated on the 9th of Av. And so we have these two conceptual perspectives. And I think as time will unfold, I think we're going to see the same kind of a discussion surrounding October 7th and its aftermath? Should it be separate? And already, as I mentioned to you, the Knesset has already determined this separate day. Or should it be on Tisha B'Av? Or, my personal practice is both when it comes to the Holocaust. I observe Yom HaShoah very sincerely and seriously. That was the day, the 27th of the month of Nisan, set aside by the Knesset to commemorate the Holocaust. And on Tisha B'Av, I recite a Kinah, an elegy for the Holocaust, and I speak about the Holocaust a lot. My feeling is that this year, I will be speaking less about the Holocaust and more about October 7th. I'm writing an article now on the changing mode of Holocaust commemoration in American synagogues in the last 40 years. A friend of mine in Israel is editing a book about Holocaust memory and asked me if I would write on this subject. And I'm talking to a bunch of colleagues of mine, rabbinic colleagues across the United States. And before October 7th, I would have asked, how is it different now than it was 40 years ago? And I myself, as a rabbi, have experienced the diminution of Yom HaShoah programs, the intensity of those programs. Fewer and fewer people are coming as more and more survivors regretfully pass away. But now the last question is, how is October 7th affecting the commemoration of the Holocaust? And I'm feeling in my inner essence, as I think about my teaching this coming Tisha B'Av, I've been teaching for the last 30 years for 8 hours a day on the Tisha B'Av. I'm planning on doing that from Ra'anana this year. Go to yutorah.org and you'll be able to access me for 8 hours. God should give me strength. But as I'm thinking through in my own mind, I'm thinking that October 7th is going to take over a lot of thought. What I will do on 2 days after Simchat Torah this year, I don't know yet. But I think this is an ongoing question. So the issue about the Shoah and the debate about the Shoah, I think, is going to be framing a lot of the discussion about what's going to be happening now post-October 7th.
Rabbi Schacter, my last question has to do not with the day that we will mark the tragedy in our liturgical consciousness, but the day that this generation in particular, those of us who were alive and saw all of those horrible videos and held the hands of brothers and sisters who suffer, for this generation in particular, how we are supposed to summon up the happiness of Simchat Torah.
I have no idea. I have a relationship with many, many, many rabbis. I run conferences for pulpit rabbis across North America and beyond. The last conference that I ran was at the end of June, and rabbis are already beginning to think, so what are we going to do on this Simchat Torah? What is it going to look like? I told them, check back with me in 2 months. I don't know. I need to think about this deeply. I don't know how it's going to be possible to have an unbridled, joyful Simchat Torah as we, thank God, we're able to have for so long. There's no doubt that the shadow, and more than a shadow, the deep, maybe even crushing shadow of October 7th is going to overwhelm Simchat Torah, which was October 7th. But yet, on the other hand, Simchat Torah, and how to thread that needle, I wish I had an answer, John. I don't have an answer.
Tell us once more the website that we can go to learn with you on Tisha B'Av.
I invite all of you to join me. I will be in Ra'anana in Israel, Eastern time. I'll be starting at 1:30 in the morning. But if you go on the website, you'll be able to start from the beginning anytime you access it. www.yutorah.org. Then I think there's a / and it should be either Tisha B'Av or my name. If you go on this site, you shouldn't have any trouble finding.
And I also want to invite listeners who are interested in the large themes of this conversation to enroll completely for free in Rabbi Schacter's online course about Jewish memory and Jewish tragedy, all of which can be watched at your own pace in video presentations at memory.tikvahfund.org. Rabbi Schacter, thank you for joining us.
I would say it's a pleasure, but you've raised very, very deep, serious questions that I grapple with. I appreciate the opportunity to grapple with them with you. And I pray for wisdom, both to try to understand a little more about what's going on and to have the emotional capacity to contend with the challenges that we're now facing, especially in this solemn period of the Jewish calendar.